My name is John Hare, and for the last 3 decades, I've been working on a technology called IgY antibodies, or avian antibodies. And basically what that is, it's you get antibodies from the eggs of laying hens, or in certain cases, ostriches. The reason I bring this up is that I just finished watching a Fifth Estate show that was dedicated to the ostrich farm out in Edgewood, British Columbia. And that story, the Edgewood, British Columbia ostrich story, started back in December of 2024 when a bunch of birds, and I think it was 69 in total out of a flock of about 450, died because of, at that time they didn't know what, but eventually those birds were tested. It was determined that they had been exposed to H5N1, or avian flu. And for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who does the testing and the basically trying to maintain the food system in Canada, a healthy food system, is the protocol when you find a flock of birds that have H5N1 is you cull the birds. In other words, they call it stamping out. In other words, you virtually kill all the birds. The idea being that you will prevent the spread of that avian flu to other flocks of birds. I did a video back, I don't know, 6 months or so ago on the thought of killing those birds. Again, they were just determined to be infected back in December of 2024, and the actual cull didn't happen until November of 2025. And so during that whole period of time, that's when the fight was on as to whether or not the ostriches should be saved or not saved, and went all the way to the Supreme Court in Canada, and eventually what happened on I think the 6th and the 7th of November of 2025, the CFIA and the sharpshooters went in and killed the remaining birds on that time. And it generated a huge amount of publicity throughout that whole period from December of 2024 all the way through to the actual kill in November. And by the way, it's still generating publicity. And as I mentioned, the show that I'm talking about right now was the Fifth Estate show that sort of basically was to be a wrap-up of what really happened during that whole period. Unfortunately, and at least in my opinion, unfortunately, the title of the Fifth Estate show was the Ostrich Con. So right off the bat, the narrative is there was a con going on this whole ostrich thing. Whether there was or there wasn't, that's a good question. I have sympathy for the owners of the farm for sure. I actually spoke to them several times on the phone. They certainly had their opinions as to why they felt that these ostriches should be kept alive. And one of the things they cited, it was avian antibodies. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've been working on avian antibodies for almost 3 decades. As a matter of fact, next year will be 30 years. And one thing about the idea of avian antibodies, are they real or are they not real? And that was one of the things that came up during the interview with, I guess it was Mark Kelly from the Fifth Estate. And, didn't show a lot of credibility to the idea of IgY antibodies from birds. Well, like I said, I've been working on it for the last 30 years. And the story that came out of the ostrich farms, that was something that they were working on, which they had been doing for the last 4 years. And I can tell you, 4 years, you learn a lot, but you learn a lot more over 30 years. And basically what I've learned over the whole period of time, and one of the things that was implied by the farmers out there was that they felt that they were being stepped on to a certain degree because of other forces, more so than just the avian flu. In other words, if the avian flu was the reason for killing those birds, to prevent the spread of the avian flu to other flocks of birds, then those birds should have been stamped out right away, because there's no way after, really virtually 10 months that the spread, if there was going to be any spread of that flu, would have been constrained by keeping those birds alive. So regardless of what your thoughts are on whether or not the birds should have been spared or not spared, the idea of the avian antibodies wasn't something that was fictitious. And again, I mentioned the fact that we've been working on it for a long time. And by the way, it's a brand new technology. It's been around for, the 3 decades for sure, even a little longer, but it's never been taken to market. It's never been legitimized. And, I have my feeling just to maybe why that was the case. And, one of the things that Dave Belinsky, one of the owners, the co-owners of the birds out there, he mentioned that he felt that Big Pharma was probably against the idea of these antibodies ever seeing the light of day from the point of view of becoming treatments. I might be able to agree with him to a certain degree because, we've been working at this for 30 years and we actually have invented the better mousetrap in certain treatments that we've done better than what the standard of care is right now for certain infections and such. And haven't seen a lot of, I guess the word would be traction. In other words, when you build the better mousetrap in any other industry, the saying goes, they beat a path to your door. Well, that hasn't been really the case with the antibodies. And I wonder if it isn't the fact that the antibodies work pretty well. And if you stop and think about antibodies in general, we've had pharmaceuticals, synthetic pharmaceuticals from Big Pharma, probably 110 or 15 years or so. Probably the biggest discovery was antibiotics back in the 1920s, and really they came to the forefront in the Second World War, where they prevented a whole lot of people who had injuries in the Second World War from dying of bacterial infections because of those other injuries. So there's no question that some certain synthetic drug treatments have been very helpful to mankind. But you think about before the synthetic drugs came out, man has been on this planet for I don't know how long, millions of years probably. And what has kept us alive in all that time before Big Pharma came along to save us? Amazing. If they saved us, how did we get by for all those years beforehand? Well, your immune system is really what keeps us going. And matter of fact, what your immune system produces to keep you alive through infections before there were any antibiotics or any vaccines was the antibodies that your immune system produced to protect you against those pathogens. Well, one thing about what we're producing is antibodies. So, something that has obviously worked for keeping mankind alive for the millions of years we've been on the planet should work from the point of view of being an actual treatment. Now, how these treatments are made, you take the immune system of an ostrich or chickens, which is what we use, and you manipulate the immune system by vaccinating. We're not against vaccines. You vaccinate those birds to produce an immune system response that produces antibodies in those birds. Those antibodies are transferred into the eggs of the bird, be it, again, an ostrich or a chicken. And those antibodies in the egg can then be harvested and used as treatments. And in our case, we've now got a phase 2 clinical trial ongoing. It's stalled because we're out of money, but it's ongoing to the point where a treatment against C. difficile infection. And C. difficile is a bacterial infection in the gut that affects people typically when they've had an antibiotic treatment for something else. And that antibiotic treatment for the something else causes a disruption in your gut flora, making you susceptible to that bacterial infection. C. diff, not many people know about it, but I'll tell you, everybody in healthcare certainly knows about it. There's not anybody in the healthcare field that hasn't heard of C. difficile, and I would bet 7 out of 10 of the general population hasn't heard of it otherwise. So we actually have a treatment that's working better than the standard of care, which is antibiotics. Typically, when you get a bacterial infection, you take an antibiotic to treat it. In our case, our antibodies have been working great, and so that's been something that we've been trying to get moving forward. It is the better mousetrap, and why aren't we getting traction? Why isn't Big Pharma coming to us and saying, "Man, this is looking great. We'd like to see this work for you"? Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that ostrich farm drew a lot of attention to basically the CFIA, which was sort of too bad that they got sort of nailed in this thing. They have a protocol and they tried to follow the protocol, which is stamping out, which whether that's good, bad, or otherwise is another question. It's a protocol that comes from the World Health Organization probably, and not necessarily applied initially to ostriches, mostly applied to large layer barns where you're getting 300,000 birds in one layer operation, and 1 or 2 of them get sick, and it doesn't take long for the whole barn to be sick, which didn't happen with the ostriches. Irrespective, the whole point is that they brought attention to the avian antibody business, which is something we've been trying to bring attention to for a long time, with not much help. In other words, the better mousetrap in this business doesn't seem to be working, maybe because it works too well. And so we've seen some amazing things. We've got the therapeutic treatment, for treating C. diff. We know we can take that same treatment and use it as a preventive, which would be very nice to prevent the infection itself. Unfortunately, most people don't know about the infection. to the point where why would they even be asking about, is there any way to prevent it? And by the way, that's the other thing. Our preventive treatment would actually save the healthcare system about 2 to 1. In other words, the cost of preventing one case of C. difficile, which is very expensive. You get that in the hospital. Somebody gets sick with it. By the way, 6 to 10% mortality rate besides. So it's not just the fact that it's going to cost the healthcare industry a bunch of money. Could kill the person who gets it. So it'd be nice to prevent it altogether. And it's not a pleasant infection to begin with. A lot of profuse diarrhea, that kind of thing. It can go on for a long time as well. So we can also come up with the preventive. And by the way, we've even taken the technology further. My background is animal agriculture, and I got into this originally because we ended up producing antibodies for baby pigs. E. coli is something that affects, it's a bacteria that infects baby pigs and causes production problems for those, baby pig animals. And so, we've got an actual registered treatment, registered through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, by the way, to treat and prevent diarrhea caused by E. coli bacteria in baby pigs. So the technology is very real, and it's unfortunately that it's sort of been slammed to a certain degree, and I don't blame the farmers out there. They knew what they were talking about. Unfortunately, maybe the industry doesn't want it because it works very well, but it certainly is new. It's something that hasn't been accepted into the traditional treatments that we expect. Bacteria is typically treated with antibiotics, and vaccines are typically the way of preventing viruses. So, as a matter of fact, we've come up with a term. You've got antibiotics, you've got probiotics, you've got prebiotics. Well, we've now coined the phrase megabiotics, which is microbiome egg antibodies to treat various infections initially in the gut, which would be E. coli and C. difficile, and who knows what other things in the gut could lead to chronic illnesses and those types of things. The point of this whole video was to say, okay, look, that whole ostrich farm thing, it was terrible to have happened. My original video said I didn't think that those birds should be culled because they were culled so much later than when they'd been, observed to be a problem, to the point where any transmission or if the avian flu was going to be moved on from there, then it would have long happened. And so that was my point of view. And what they were doing, they were saying that because those birds had survived, 70 to 80% of the birds survived the avian flu, to the point where the immunity that those birds had could potentially be used as antibodies to prevent and treat avian flu in other flocks of birds. So, and that was how they got, Bobby Kennedy involved in the United States, and Dr. Oz, the head of CMS, which is Medicare, Medicaid down in the United States, involved, saying they would even move those birds because they could see the benefit of the potential antibodies because those birds had been exposed to H5N1. Regardless, the technology, megabiotics, is very much legitimate. We've been working on it for just about 30 years. We're getting close, and that's a hard part. The potential of it is incredible. It's not very expensive. It works. You cure people. Maybe the industry, the healthcare industry, is not that keen on that type of thing, which is a terrible thing to say. But, in any business, you need customers. And guess what? Patients are your customers. So regardless, Fifth Estate, they did a video just to sort of wrap up the whole thing. On the ostrich farm, they called it the Ostrich Con. I thought that was a little heavy because, their whole thing was pitched against the ostriches. My argument could be, well, why Fifth Estate did you go in there with somewhat of a blinders on that it was going to be, this kind of approach? In other words, maybe you should come and interview me and we'll talk about the idea of avian antibodies and what the potential is for those things. And basically that's what these guys, the owners of the ostrich farm, were trying to get across. They just didn't have enough experience with it, and they didn't have the lab facilities, which, by the way, we have completely here in Winnipeg. Art Kelly, I invite you to come and have a talk with me, and we'll, go over this technology and see where it could lead to, which would be great. John Hare signing off. Megabiotics.